Some years ago I found out about this wonderful new technology called blockchain that could change the whole world and make it a more fair and open place for everyone. I got very excited about the concept, reading more about it, and I started going through all kinds of courses to get certifications and stuff because I was really hoping to work in this newly developing field. And so I went and learned more about it. It was full of shit, and that's a damn shame. Of all the technological cults around the world today, few get as much attention and traction as blockchains. Wherever you look nowadays, whether you want to make payments or make some contracts online or maybe buy some JPEGs of monkeys, blockchains are everywhere and they rake in a ton of sweet cash. So what is this all about? A quick note, I really recommend watching my previous video first on basics of cryptography to better understand some of the concepts involved in today's topic. So blockchains aren't really that complicated if we go down to basics, as they consist of basically two concepts. One is public key cryptography and the second concept is linked lists, which is like a normal list where each element has a reference to the next one, so you can logically connect them into a directed chain. Now, the difference between a normal linked list and a blockchain is basically in that each element in the blockchain depends on the previous one. So if you make a change to one element on the blockchain, you will also need to recalculate each subsequent element, which makes it easy to see tampering. To add a new element to a blockchain, you also need to perform a very computationally demanding task, which is infeasible to try alone, so you need the extended network, basically the entire network of that blockchain, to do it collectively. And even that, it takes a considerable amount of time. Now, initially, the whole shtick of Bitcoin was that it separated itself from existing financial systems and the meddling of banks, governments, or any other powerful cabals that would try to interfere with your transactions or flows of your money. And B, it also removes humans from the decision-making process in verifying whether transactions should be accepted to the blockchain. Instead, that role is delegated to a strictly defined mathematical algorithm, which by its very nature has no bias and cannot stray from the correct path. So, okay, so far sounds actually very nice, sounds very fair and transparent. Unfortunately, in practice, the beautiful dream tragically falls apart. So blockchains that rely on those heavy computational tasks to add new elements to the chain are called proof-of-work blockchains. And unfortunately, that exact proof-of-work mechanism, while being the source of its security, is also its biggest enemy. The problem is, proof-of-work does not scale very well. As long as the amount of transactions and their rate stays relatively low, you can somewhat use, let's say, Bitcoin as an actual currency. However, the problem is all existing cryptocurrencies are way behind in terms of transaction rate compared to classic money. And the amount of computational power required to actually make a transaction in a blockchain is too large. It cannot be properly scaled. And if we tried, we would probably just boil the planet from the sheer amount of heat generated by all the hardware. And there's no way out really, it's a mathematical dead end, because if you try to decrease the complexity to speed up the transactions, you would sacrifice security in return. But okay, let's say proof of work doesn't work, no pun intended. Are there any alternatives? Well, technically yes. There are so-called proof of stake algorithms as well. Unlike proof of work, proof of stake algorithms do not rely on heavy computational tasks and instead involve participants in the network into the decision process. They can stake their existing value, or they can form some kind of a committee, or really any other arrangement that a particular network wants to make. The problem is, you may notice something strange here. Are we involving humans now? Isn't that what we were supposed to avoid by the very design of this whole thing? Well, yes. Turns out that to achieve any feasibility, blockchains had to go back on one of their core promises. Another big promise of the blockchain community was the whole decentralized thing, a distributed ledger that no one can hold in their hands and manipulate alone. the community has the ultimate power over the network. Unfortunately, that principle does not necessarily hold very well in practice. You see, the desire for convenience pretty quickly drove people using cryptocurrency to actual centralized services like Coinbase. What do you know? Turns out those centralized services like PayPal weren't actually around to just be evil and take our money, but instead were actually providing some valuable service that was in demand. The blockchain community learned that the hard way. The only way to make cryptocurrency somewhat feasible was to add human input and add centralized elements, basically betraying every principle that blockchains were supposed to be built on. By trying to make an alternative to existing financial systems, the blockchain community eventually created basically those same systems with a new look, extra steps, and a bunch of other new problems. The problem is, if you have created a system very similar to the existing one, it's much more feasible to just use the existing one without the extra steps and extra risks of blockchain. And it shows. If you see how new cryptocurrencies on the market are advertised, you will not see them advertised as a new way of payments, an alternative to existing financial systems. No, you will see them advertised as get-rich-quick schemes that promise you a ton of money when the whole thing goes to the moon! Now, another possible application for blockchains would be smart contracts, where any kind of agreement you make between two parties is stored on the blockchain, not necessarily related to strictly currencies, basically any kind of custom-made contract which is not defined by human interpretation but instead is defined strictly algorithmically and without interpretation. Problem is, you don't really need that. You can just use digital signatures. They've been around for decades, they worked before, they work now, and they will sure as hell continue to work later. If you're so inclined to make some kind of a chain, you can just link those contracts and keep signing their combination with the previous one on the chain. You do not need an actual blockchain and all the overhead associated with it. This is really a recurring thing in the blockchain community of solving a problem that isn't really there in the first place and reinventing the bicycle in the process. Now, the big problem with tech industry is that people that do not properly understand the technology are often swayed by it due to the way it is presented to them. You can take something completely useless and present it as something that is there to save the world and make everything better, and people will buy into it. I strongly believe that most people are inherently good and they want to do good, which is exactly what those kind of tech industry scammers thrive on. And again, I was one of those people at some point. I got really swayed by the whole thing. I thought it was really interesting. It looked like something very futuristic, independent from the state, banks, and powerful cabals and everything. It's a nice sounding idea. It's hard to just pass it by. And I also know how uncomfortable it is to admit, especially to yourself, that you were fooled. And sure, I can actually easily believe that people that have created the concept of blockchains actually had good intentions. But the thing is how it turned out. Your intentions don't matter nearly as much as what it turned out like in the end. And reality is such that blockchains do not solve any of the tasks it was set to solve. And in fact, it just became a haven for all kinds of scammers luring people in with the promise of big money. And the problem is, like in any good lie, there is a small grain of truth in there. Because you certainly can make money on crypto, if you're not the last sucker that jumps the ship. It's especially hard to resist temptations of crypto where so many popular people like Elon Musk in his holiness, Gary Vaynerchuk in his holiness, and all the other bullshitters are constantly pushing on unsuspecting people. This is actually harmful. And the indoctrination of the blockchain community is so strong that it's almost impossible to quickly rip people out of them back into reality. A craving for validation from that community and the craving for that sense of belonging makes sure that people either dismiss all the criticism outright or label it as blasphemy from some boomers that just do not understand the future and are stupid. even if people in the community themselves have no idea how blockchains actually work. And that really is the big problem with the tech industry and the cults that form around it. They're not formed based on expertise, they are formed based on faith. But that's just one aspect of the blockchain craze. I also have a big problem with the entire trajectory that blockchains intended to take in the first place. Now imagine that every morning your neighbor comes to your apartment and just punches you in the face as hard as he can. And he keeps coming every day and doing the same thing. And instead of settling things with him and making him stop, which a reasonable person would do, you instead decide to invest into better painkillers so that it wouldn't hurt when he punches you. The whole blockchain craze is a form of political procrastination that tries to make some fancy technology in this escapism attempt instead of actually fixing the issue with the financial system. The financial system is okay. It has been polished throughout the years, it can work well. It's just run by assholes. That's what needs to be fixed. And remember, with the initial premise of blockchain, that basically everyone in power is your enemy, it doesn't matter how many layers of fancy cryptography you build, when someone can just come to you, punch you in the face, and tell you you're not allowed to use it now. It is illegal now, in fact. Like, what are you gonna do? All the fancy blockchains and this alternative financial system, it still exists on top of existing infrastructure, on top of existing society, on top of existing legislation. As much as you want to escape that, you will not be able to. And yet, despite all of their shortcomings, blockchains are absolutely booming. Perhaps the best way to get money from one of those fancy Silicon Valley investors is just to slap blockchain on your product. Who cares if it's actually useful if it brings in the money, right? In fact, get this. Some years ago, Bosch came up with an idea of a blockchain-powered refrigerator. I will repeat, a blockchain-powered refrigerator. In their pitch, they basically tell you that this blockchain allows you to track energy usage and in fact helps you use your energy more consciously and efficiently. It is very ironic that the technology notorious for wasting energy in incredible amounts is stated to be used for more responsible energy usage. Oh, the irony. And if by some chance you think that big investors know what they're doing, like Alex, they wouldn't invest in anything. They wouldn't be rich if they were making such stupid decisions. And this is the part where I just remind you of the existence of Theranos. Yes, that Theranos. That massive disaster, which by the way also formed a technological cult around it for quite some time. There have been many technologies throughout the years surrounded by genuinely good intentions that have met a very tragic fate. And blockchains, unfortunately, earned their place on that list as well. Good but misguided intentions and disastrous results, which I'm afraid down the line will drag a ton of people with it when the bubble inevitably pops. Sure, you can make a quick buck off of it, but I'm afraid this thing just has no future. By its very nature, it cannot have one. And that really is tragic. Thank you so much for watching this video. I would be very grateful if you clicked on the like button, on the subscribe button, maybe even the bell button, who knows? Maybe even left a comment. Tell me what's wrong. Tell me what's right. Tell me why I'm stupid for not believing in blockchain. Tell me why I'm super smart for not believing in it. Tell me whatever the hell you want. I want to hear. And if you don't do all those things, you will invest in Bitcoin right before Bogdanovs decide to dump it. You have been warned.